Michael Mutava is a research fellow at the New South Institute and joins us now. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. If we could just start by looking at the last decade, what has changed in terms of migration trends and patterns on the continent?
Thank you very much for having me. If we look at the last decade, really, what has happened a lot is that we have a lot of migration that is happening within the regions in Africa. For example, within EAC, within SADC, and within ECOWAS. However, we'll realize that compared to the global averages, migration in Africa is still very little. But it happens a lot within the regions. So that's my view in the last decade.
So you say in 2020 there was an increase of 62% from 1990, and then 25.4 million international migrants or migration occurred. Can you expand a little bit more on this? What were the drivers behind that, and particularly which countries, if we're talking about internationally?
When we talk about the 62%, we're looking at global increase in people coming to the continent, not necessarily to the countries, but an overall picture of people coming to the continent. I just want to highlight that some of the people actually originate and end at the continent. So part of this 62% involves people that actually just move between African countries. I just want to highlight that the level of income for Africa as a continent is low, and therefore we do not experience a lot of immigrants. However, within African countries themselves, there is some level of movement. So just a small proportion coming outside, plus those people that move within Africa have grown to the percentage of 62%. However, those that have left are 97%. So this just goes back to my previous point, that the amount of migration that happens within the continent is quite low compared to the global averages. In terms of the specific countries that are the destination countries, South Africa is leading in terms of receiving people from outside of the continent, but we also have other main income countries like Kenya and Nigeria, but South Africa is definitely leading on that front. But 62% involves people coming from outside the continent, as well as those that move within the continent between African countries, essentially.
And as you say, South Africa seems to be the one that has experienced the greatest in number in receiving people. This is against a backdrop of 112%, I think you say, of a population growth since 1990. So how do you divvy it up in terms of the countries where economic migration from occurs and to beyond South Africa? You mentioned Kenya and other countries, but I'm also just thinking about the ease of travel, or how convenient it is for people to go to those countries as economic migrants.
Something that I would like to mention here is that migration has its own agency, and that means that if migrants find an incentive to move, irrespective of the legal constrictions, for example, or irrespective of any bottlenecks that might be erected for them, they will always move. So I'll give you examples here. Like in looking at the major routes of migration within the continent, for a country like Kenya, they have very frosty relationship with Somalia, but Kenya has the main sending country as Somalia. A lot of migrants coming to Kenya in Africa come from Somalia. If you look at something like Nigeria, the main destination country for Nigerian migrants is Cameroon. And if you look at South Africa, for example, a lot of migrants come from Zimbabwe. But how is that linked to the agency? Because politics is necessary sometimes, but I will tell you, real developments in the real economy are necessary and sufficient. For as long as people find that there is an incentive to move, they will move. But this is not surprising, because if you look at South Africa, for example, the main countries that South Africa trades with within the continent are four of them. Four of those come from SADC, and those are the main countries with whom South Africa shares a lot of migration with. That is Mozambique, that is Zimbabwe, that's Namibia, that's Botswana. If you look at Kenya and the frosty relationships with Somalia, the value of exports of Kenya to Somalia in 2021 was around 122 million US dollars, and that's a lot compared. If you look at South Africa, for example, with Kenya is around 36 US million. If you look at Kenya with South Sudan is around 155. So 122 is actually quite healthy. If you look at South Africa and Zimbabwe, for example, is in excess of 3 billion US dollars. If you look at Nigeria and Cameroon, in excess of 500 million US dollars. So migration really, it has an agency, it has a mind of itself. And if migrants find that there's an economic benefit underlying, they will always move.
So that's also interesting, because often the understanding is that there's a mass exodus within Africa because of poverty, war, and bad governance. But you say the conversation is a little bit more complex than that, especially when we talk about the African Continental Free Trade area, that migration in itself is not being encouraged, rather because of the strains of resources on the receiving countries. But going forward, it is a conversation that we're going to have, because yes, remittances are very important, but just the general ideology, if we're saying intra-African trade, is a paramount at this point. So how do we have that conversation about encouraging migration to show the benefits thereof?
So my take really is that migration is not a pandemic. Migration is not malaria. A lot of people have this notion that migration is something bad, but migration is not something bad. It's actually a necessity. If you look at how migration or the single market in Europe evolved, the European Union, from 1957, in the Rome Statute, first of all, they capture migration as a freedom. The document that articulates the free movement protocol is actually called the Four Freedoms. That is the freedoms of movement, of goods, of goods, of persons, of capital, and of services. Okay, and in 1986, the right to migrate was actually enshrined within the European Charter of Human Rights. So that shows you that migration is a necessity, and those four important prerequisites have been very significant to the success of the European single market. Now, coming to our continent, the myth that we were trying to bust, for example, is that migration is, we're moving like a mass exodus away from the continent, you see, which is not necessarily true, because if you look at the net figure we're talking about, first of all, it only happens in a segment of the continent, the rest of Africa, where we have the Arabian countries, for example, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Egypt. But in the sub-Saharan region, we do not have a lot of that exodus. That's the first myth busted. Movement also, being very little and not being important to trade, that is another myth you are trying to bust. As I have just highlighted, you have seen that there is an important nexus between trade and migration, as shown by the important movement within Somalia and Kenya, Zimbabwe and South Africa, and Nigeria and her neighbors, especially Cameroon. So we find that going forward, for us to realize the benefits of the AfCFTA, we have to enshrine African movement or free movement within. The better example that I think of is the idea of having to love what the truck driver carries, but you don't like the truck driver. You have to embrace the truck driver as well, for free movement to happen. And those are important prerequisites to the single market in Africa as it was in Europe. And it has to be seen as such.
And it's also, I suppose, leading into this discussion that has been underway for a long time about removing borders, a borderless Africa, a very important issue, especially given the cost of travel within the continent. So if you can make it easier, as you say. Michael Mutava, research fellow at the New South Institute, speaking to us about migration patterns and trends on the continent.